Hello and welcome to today's webinar. As a reminder before we get moving on the webinar, be sure to keep in mind that the Compliant Connect C2 Summit is happening on September 23rd to 25th. This year's summit will be held at the Omni Dallas Hotel in Dallas, Texas. And if you're looking for further information regarding that, please check out c2summit.convey.com. Today's webinar will be Eliminate B Notice and Other Penalty Notices. I will be doing today's webinar. I am Ray Grove, and I'm a product manager here for Convey. So, a quick agenda of the information we'll be covering is a general overview of the B Notice process. We're also going to cover P Notices. We're going to talk about things that you can be doing more proactively to eliminate notices, some of the best practices, abatement best practices, and then as well, at the end, we'll provide some additional resources for you to be able to check out to be sure you're doing everything you can and get your questions answered. One of the things we're going to be talking about today is proactive versus reactive processes. Now we're going to start with the reactive side of the equation. When we get to the best practices, we'll be going more over the proactive approaches you can take to your B Notice process and overall TIN remediation and tax identity management. So to begin, let's take a brief moment to just think about the timeline from an information reporting perspective. So in January, all of us are printing and mailing our 1099s to the recipients. And in between January and April, a lot of times when we're handling corrections, processing from the standpoint of recipients getting their forms, maybe there being an issue, and then in April actually transmitting those records to the IRS. Now in October is when we will receive the CP 2100A, which is the B Notice, and we'll be sending solicitations, at which point in November we collect responses, update records, either start or stop backup withholding, and then in August, for those previous P Notices, is when we actually receive the P Notice, the 972CG form. Where once again, we're responding to the penalty notice, sending out solicitations, and doing what we can to remediate that information. So what is a B Notice? Well, a B Notice is a backup withholding notice due to a missing or incorrect name TIN. The following form types on the slide here are the ones that it applies to. There's also referred to as the CP 2100 or CP 2100A, and they're going to be based on the prior year's transmittals. So they're not for the transmittals that you just most recently did. Generally, they're going to be for the prior year before transmittals. From a standpoint of what you have to do when you receive a B Notice is, first of all, you need to search for any of the accounts that have the same name and TIN combination. The reason for this is you want to be sure that you gather all accounts, all relevant information for that individual, and treat them all the same and appropriately. For those that you identify as matches, you have 15 business days to send the B Notice solicitation. So that's business days. When we're talking about the IRS and the rules, they go by business days. And then you also have 15 business days for the response. If you fail to gather this information, you must begin backup withholding. You should do this immediately for anybody with a missing TIN. Now, for non-matches, there is no solicitation required. So if you searched and you have somebody that's maybe similar but not an exact match to the individual on the B Notice, that does not fall into requiring a solicitation. First or second B Notice. So to begin, when we talk about first or second B Notice, it's important to understand that the IRS does not track this for you. This is your responsibility to track this information. And if at some point you are audited, you're going to need to show them how you track this information. And keep in mind there's a 2 and 3 year rule. So a second B notice only applies if it's a second B notice within a 3-year period of time. Now it's going to be a first B notice if an account identified on 1 B notice or identified on 2 B notices outside the 3 calendar years. So if you only received 1 for the account, or if you received 2 but it hasn't been within the 3-year period of time, it's considered a first B notice. Now it'll be a second B notice if you actually have 2 within that 3-year period of time. So what do you send? Well, for a first B notice, you'll send a cover letter, a Form W-9 or a substitute, an optional reply envelope, and and you actually don't have to file a corrected return. So it's always a good idea and best practice to provide an optional reply envelope that just increases the likelihood of you being able to get that information. Now, when we get later on in the presentation, we are going to go over some of the things you can do to actually move this process forward and gather this information much easier than having to deal with the B notices. For a second B notice, really pretty much the same process with the exception of sending an SSA printout. And then the other part to really keep in mind is you need that SSA because a Form W-9 does not satisfy a second B notice. So if it is in a second B notice status, the W-9 form does not satisfy that requirement. So now, so for first B notice, ask yourself, did I receive a W-9 within 30 days? If yes, you update your records with the certified name and TIN. And if no, you begin backup withholding within that 30 business day period of time. If it's second B notice, did you receive the SSN printout or the 147C? The 147C, just as a reminder, is the business equivalent of the SSN printout. And really it's the same process. So if you did get that information, you update your records. If not, you have to begin back withholding. Now there's a couple new things that I want to talk about real quick here from what we covered earlier. One, the penalty notice has a few more form types. Form 1042S for individuals that don't have a tax identification number. Form 3921, 3922, and the all-new Form 1099K. Another important note is penalties are increasing. We've also have seen the Form SSA 7028 being replaced by SSA print to resolve a second B notice. So notice of proposed penalty. So what types of things, when you get that penalty notice, are you going to be penalized for? Well, first and foremost, there are going to be records with a missing or incorrect TIN, i.e. those records of which you received a B notice. You also can be penalized for late returns, sending them in bad format, or wrong media, and the penalties are listed below. Just so you know, the information on penalties and the rates is also available on Convey.com. So now that you've received a Form 972CG, also known as a P notice or penalty notice, what are the steps you should take? Well, one, you need to answer within 45 business days. You can request an extension within that 45-day window. However, you need to provide some sort of a response. The payer, the payer, can abate the penalty by establishing reasonable cause, and the reasonable cause is going to fall generally in one of these 3 areas. You perform the required actions for the B notices, you did the annual solicitations for the missing TINs, and you perform the annual solicitations for incorrect name TINs. As a side note, you're not going to be imposed a penalty if 1/2 of 1% of your total returns were penalties. So if it's a very small number of your overall filing volume in which you had issue, you will not be assessed a penalty. Now, the solicitation process for 972CG is actually very similar to B notices. you don't need to send if a B notice was sent in the same year. So if you get a penalty notice for an individual and you got a P note and a B notice for that same individual, and you sent out that B notice in that same calendar year, you do not need to send out a penalty notice. There is a couple pieces here on Form 1099-R. You only have 30 days to send a solicitation, 45 days to respond, and one thing you can do is also include a W-4P for if the individual wants to do any additional withholding. So now we've kind of covered the basics from a standpoint of what are the rules you need to follow, what are the things you need to watch for, what are some of the things that we're going to move to as the best practices. So those are the things that you can be doing right now to improving your process to ultimately eliminate the notices. So for most of us, as a reminder, we really follow the basic process where we file the 1099s, we receive the B notices, we send W-9s, we receive 972 CGs, we write an abatement letter, and we go through this cyclical cycle where we're providing information to the IRS is saying, actually, that information is wrong, and we do this year after year after year. However, once again, that process is a very reactive one. And from a standpoint is, why does it matter if it's reactive? Well, the big issue is it costs a lot of money. One, with the penalties. Two, with the time that you spend as an organization or an individual in an organization working on these types of activities versus doing other more value-add activities. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about identity management as it relates to third-party information reporting, 1099 reporting, and how that comes into play of having good identity management practices in order to reduce your B&P notice burden. So one thing when we talk about identity management is understanding the IDs that we work with. Depending on your organization, you probably work with different types of IDs, different types of customers. Some of you might have customers if you're a bank or investment firm. Those are going to be the relationships that you're going to care about most. You're going to have to be very careful about the types of communications that you have, but also your access to the individuals is going to be better than, let's say, if they're vendors and maybe you only did business with them once a year. And there's also situations like providers for health insurance and merchants. So if you think about it, depending on who you work with as an organization or who you're reporting on, this can be a far simpler or far more difficult process to collect this information. And for a lot of you, it probably sounds hard, and you're asking, can I skip it? Well, no. Because like we said earlier, there's penalties, there's fines, and in fact, willful neglect is fines plus up to a year in jail and mandatory backup withholding, which if you want a good way to ruin business relationships or relationships with customers, having to do that backup withholding is in a lot of ways a good way to start that process of having a bad relationship. So by having a more proactive approach in managing these IDs, you can avoid having to do things like mandatory backup withholding. So let's talk about old versus new. So today, the process is a very manual one. You're handling your paper W-9s, and it's terribly reactive. And what we want to move to is an automated, real-time, and proactive approach. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a moment here and collectively take our heads out of the sand. We're going to talk about the 4 steps to correcting your data and even identifying the data that you have. And the 4 steps are broken apart in these pieces that you see here of identifying the bad information, soliciting corrections, collecting those responses, and updating the source systems. So let's begin with step 1. Know what you don't know. So in identifying bad name TIN information or identifying the quality of the information that you're receiving, first thing you need to do is determine how you're going to do that. So like we discussed earlier, many of us take a much more reactive approach of waiting for that B notice to arrive from the IRS. But what we really want to talk about is doing it better, more proactively, and why that's value. So let's talk about a real-time approach with things like real-time tin match or even the IRS bulk tin match system. Now, real-time tin verification is really great when you're talking about one-time payments, when payments immediate, like a cash on delivery, or if verifying the information is very difficult after you've made the payment, like somebody winning a jackpot, for instance. It's also really good to help you avoid common errors. So if you have an incorrect name, individual or company, like for instance, Amtrak is actually National Railroad Passenger Corporation, and James Bond versus Jane Bonds are two really good examples. Or if it's the wrong tin, do you submit it as an SSN or an EIN, or do you leave it as either? So that's why the IRS has the tin matching services. So the IRS does offer e-services that allow you to do interactive real-time tin matching and bulk tin. The publication, which informs you on how to sign up for those services, is 2108A. The important thing to note here is signing up for these services takes time. It also requires Social Security number, just gross income of an officer of the company, so somebody with 5% shareholder value in the organization. So for a lot of organizations, it's difficult to get the appropriate individuals to sign up for these services. However, you can utilize companies like Convey that actually do this on behalf of their customers. And by using our services, you don't need to go through that process. The other thing to keep in mind when we talk about best practices to avoid those B notices is you should really be doing this on account initiation. So, for instance, submitting a bulk file to the IRS for a tin check is great from a standpoint of seeing the information that you have, but moving forward, if the initial information is wrong, it's a good idea to catch that right away. So by using interactive tin matching, you're guaranteed to get that correct information right away and avoid those common and silly mistakes. So step 2, reach out and touch someone. So now that you've identified information, you now need to solicit for the correct information. Now, if you're in the reactive approach, you need to respond via the B notice process. However, moving now more to a proactive approach, you can actually solicit for corrections in a variety of ways. The main way would be mailing a W-9 or substitute to the individual. You can contact them by email, letter or self-mailer, telephone customer service, portal on a website. Depending on your organization, these all have different costs associated depending on the size of the problem that you have. You can even get this information in person if you need to. But the big message here is when you are not in B notice status, you can solicit for this information a variety of ways. However, once you enter into that B notice status, i.e. the IRS has given you notice that this information is correct, you now need to follow their policies and their practices on collecting this information for that given situation. It's a lot more difficult to collect that information a lot of times that way. So by once again being proactive, you're able to mitigate these issues and risk right from the start. So now that you've solicited the information, now you need to get your answers. And once again, since you're outside that B notice process because you're being more proactive, you can do this a variety of ways. Once again, by web, in person, by phone, by mail, or by fax. However, it's not a one and done process. If you were to take 12,000 tins based on a 40% response rate for an organization that needed to be fixed, it would take 18 months to fix. It's an important note that this isn't something that can just be done overnight. You have to put in business practices and policies, especially if you have a lot of cleanup to do. Now, obviously, if you get beyond the stage of cleanup and you're now at the stage of managing a good business practice, you don't have this concern. But this is to be forewarned. that if you have a large number of incorrect names and TINs, it's going to take some time to resolve those issues. So now that you've collected that information and you've gotten the correct data to put into your system, now you have to think about how are you going to update your source system. So an important piece to keep in mind here is, if you're managing your 1099s, like many people outside of their standard source ERP, you need to be sure that you get that data back into your ERP so all of that information is accurate across your enterprise. You can do that either by manually keying, you can do it through spreadsheets, or you can do it through automated imports. And that, when you consider it from front to end of identifying the bad information to updating your source system, is really a completely comprehensive solution. And also it's a means in which you can put some good business practice and process around from a standpoint of how you're managing this part of your business. Now, for a lot of you, there may not be a need to do all of those things and have really thorough business practices around a lot of that. However, another approach you can view is taking a piece of what we talked about and identifying where that really fits well within your organization and where you need to shore up the most. For a lot of people, this is going to be the TIN services, either real-time or IRS bulk TIN services. So going back to the proactive versus reactive, you can see that there's a lot more things that enter into the process that you can get ahead of before you actually get into the reactive stage if you employ the appropriate technology. So when you think about it from a standpoint of where you're sitting with data cleanup in your processes, you have to ask yourself, where are you? Are you on the proactive side or are you on the reactive side? And you're not necessarily going to go from one to the other overnight, but doing what you can to mitigate the risk is definitely something all organizations should be looking at. So once again, the proactive process is really focused around identifying the incorrect information, soliciting for that information because there are no rules to solicit on how you do that prior to getting that B notice. One note on the IRS e-services is they do have some strict phishing rules for their e-services, so this is covered in the 2108A documentation. However, a violation does lead to a 96-hour lockout. So we just talked about the proactive approach from a best practices perspective. So what if you still have some errors? Because obviously if you look for mistakes, you'll find some. Well, there is a right way and a wrong way. So, B&P notice best practices. One, you want to load or input the notices as soon as possible, because once again, from receipt, you have a given amount of time to respond. You want to match against all current data right away, and you also want to apply the 2- and 3-year rule. Ideally, you want systems that actually can do this for you. You only need to do the 1 mailing per year, and the B notice mailing satisfies the penalty notice as a reminder. Now, your cover letter should be clear and easy to understand. You're going to want to include a phone number, a website, and a lot of times an FAQ with additional information and to answer questions is also a good best practices. Generally, you don't file corrections based on W-9s. So you're also going to want to look at how you're going to update the source system and automate that process as much as possible. Now, that's the B notice, but from an abatement perspective, best practices there, you're going to want to be sure that your processes are documented from a standpoint of account initiation, your 1099 process, your B notice process, and then obviously what you do when you receive those corrections. You're going to want to have processes and procedures in place. You're going to want to be able to show year-over-year progress. This is important because the IRS is not allowing people really anymore to just continually abate penalties. They're getting a lot more strict around this. A good way to show this is, show them some metrics of what you mailed, the responses, no responses. You're going to want to be able to provide the W-9s and other documentation around this process. So if you want to abate, you're going to want to be able to have this information to make your case. Now, we do have a sample abatement letter available on Convey.com. You're going to want to be sure you respond within 45 days, though. And there's several reasons why you can abate that we covered earlier, and are covered here as well. So from a key takeaways perspective, the best way to deal with B notices first and foremost is to eliminate them. And you eliminate them by putting good identity management practices in play. Secondly, you're going to want to take advantage of the IRS TIN matching program, either through the technology provider you're using for your 1099 reporting or signing up your organization. As a reminder, if you sign up your organization, you're going to need to get officer of the company and the earlier information as explained. You're going to need to document everything and be sure you utilize tools that automate and minimize the manual work and reduce or eliminate notices to begin with. And with that, we're done with today's webinar. As a quick reminder, a couple good ways to stay up to date on information is obviously our blog, 1099news.com. We're also on Twitter and LinkedIn. Our LinkedIn site is really a good place for professionals like yourself to be able to talk about best practices, what you're doing around the compliance, as well as stay up to date on what's happening. Thank you very much.